There are moments in life that seem so ordinary, so small, that we barely remember them by the time the sun rises the next morning. A stranger asks for directions, someone holds a door open, a driver stops on a lonely road to help a person in need. Most of us believe those moments end as quickly as they begin, but every now and then, one simple decision quietly sets something much larger into motion. A decision that refuses to stay in the past. A decision that comes back months later, asking a question no one is ever prepared to answer. Tonight's story is inspired by real cases involving acts of kindness, witness protection, and ordinary people who unexpectedly found themselves connected to dangerous situations. Some names, locations, and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. Because sometimes the greatest mysteries don't begin with violence or headlines. They begin with a simple choice to help someone who appears to need it. And sometimes, that choice changes everything. Late one rainy evening, Michael Carter was driving home after another exhausting shift. At 58 years old, routine had become his closest companion. Every weekday looked almost identical to the one before it. He left work after dark, drove the same stretch of highway, listened to the local radio station, and looked forward to nothing more exciting than making a fresh pot of coffee before going to bed. Since losing his wife 4 years earlier, life had become quieter than he ever imagined. Friends often invited him out, but more often than not, he preferred the comfort of familiar roads and familiar silence. That evening, the rain came down harder than usual, turning the windshield into a wall of blurred headlights and reflections. The highway was nearly empty, and the abandoned gas station just outside the county line looked exactly as it always had, forgotten, weathered, and lifeless. Until he noticed someone standing beneath the broken canopy. At first, Michael assumed his eyes were playing tricks on him. The woman barely moved. She stood with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, soaked by the rain despite the small shelter above her. She wasn't waving for help. She wasn't trying to stop passing vehicles. She simply stood there, almost as if she'd accepted that nobody was coming. Michael drove another 100 yards before something inside him refused to let him continue. He glanced into his rearview mirror. The empty highway stretched behind him, and the lonely figure remained exactly where she had been. He sighed, slowed the truck, and made a careful U-turn. It wasn't the smartest decision. Every news report he'd ever heard warned against stopping for strangers on isolated roads at night. Yet something about the woman reminded him of the values his father had taught him decades earlier, that helping another person wasn't always convenient, but it was often necessary. As the truck rolled to a stop beside her, the woman hesitated before opening the passenger door. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with tired eyes that suggested she hadn't slept well in days. Her clothes were damp, her hands trembled from the cold, and the small backpack resting against her shoulder looked far too light for someone who seemed to have nowhere else to go. Michael greeted her with a calm smile and simply asked if she needed a ride. She paused for several long seconds before quietly saying yes. Her voice carried relief, but it also carried caution, as though trusting another person had become something she no longer did easily. She climbed into the truck, fastened her seatbelt, thanked him sincerely, and stared through the rain-covered window without saying another word. Before we go any deeper into this remarkable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For several miles, silence filled the truck. Michael respected it. He had learned long ago that people often revealed more about themselves when they weren't pressured to speak. Eventually, the woman thanked him again, explaining only that her car had broken down earlier that afternoon and that she had been trying unsuccessfully to contact someone for help. She never mentioned where she came from. She never explained why she carried so little with her. Instead, she surprised Michael by asking a question that felt strangely personal. She asked whether he believed one decision could change an entire life. Michael smiled politely and answered that every important chapter in his own life had started with a single decision, even if he hadn't realized it at the time. The woman looked down at her hands before quietly responding, "I hope you're right." Those words lingered in the truck long after they were spoken, though neither of them could have imagined just how meaningful they would soon become. The following morning, Michael Carter tried to convince himself that the woman was simply another traveler who had fallen on hard times. He had spent most of his life helping people whenever he could. During his years as an army mechanic, he had learned that the smallest actions often carried the greatest weight. Whether it was repairing a stranded family's vehicle, giving directions to someone who was lost, or stopping to help a motorist with a flat tire, Michael never viewed kindness as something extraordinary. It was simply part of who he was. After retiring from military service, he settled into a quiet life outside a small American town, working long hours at a local equipment repair shop. and returning each evening to a home that had felt painfully empty ever since his wife passed away. At 58 years old, he wasn't looking for adventure. He wasn't searching for mysteries. He simply believed that if you had the ability to help someone, you should. Yet despite his efforts to move on, something about that rainy night refused to leave his thoughts. It wasn't only the woman's exhausted expression or the uncertainty in her voice. It was the strange feeling that she had wanted to say something important, but chose not to. Every now and then, while drinking his morning coffee or driving the same stretch of highway after work, he found himself wondering whether she had made it safely to wherever she was going. He never learned her name. He never asked for a phone number. He never expected to cross paths with her again. As far as Michael was concerned, their brief encounter had become nothing more than one small memory among thousands collected over a lifetime. But life has a remarkable way of returning unfinished stories when we least expect it. And although Michael couldn't explain why, that brief meeting remained clearer in his mind than countless conversations he'd had with people he had known for years. Nearly 6 months passed before anything unusual happened again. Autumn had arrived, bringing shorter days and cooler evenings, yet one particular night looked almost identical to the evening they first met. Heavy rain covered the windshield, traffic was unusually light, and Michael found himself driving the familiar highway toward home after another long shift. As he approached the abandoned gas station, he slowed almost without thinking. Perhaps it was simple curiosity. Perhaps part of him expected to see nothing at all. Then his headlights swept across the broken canopy, and his hands tightened around the steering wheel. Standing beneath that same weathered roof was the same woman. The same light-colored jacket, the same small backpack resting against her shoulder, the same posture, as though she had been waiting for someone who never arrived. Michael immediately questioned what he was seeing. 6 months had passed, yet almost nothing appeared different. She looked older only because she seemed more exhausted than before. For a brief moment, he wondered whether his memory had somehow blended with reality. Then the woman slowly turned toward the road, looked directly at his truck, and smiled with unmistakable recognition. Before Michael could decide whether to stop, she gently raised one hand, not to flag him down, but almost as if she had been expecting him all along. Michael pulled over, his heartbeat noticeably faster than it had been 6 months earlier. This time, the woman didn't hesitate before opening the passenger door. She climbed into the truck, fastened her seatbelt, and quietly looked at him with eyes that seemed far more anxious than before. Then she spoke words that instantly unsettled him. "I knew it would be you," she said softly. Michael forced a polite smile, assuming she meant that he happened to drive this road often. But before he could respond, she thanked him for stopping again and began recalling details from their first meeting that he had almost forgotten himself. She remembered the old country song playing on the radio. She remembered the coffee stain on the sleeve of his work jacket. She even remembered the exact words he had used when he first asked if she needed help. Michael listened in stunned silence. He barely remembered saying those things himself, yet somehow she remembered every detail with remarkable clarity. The questions racing through his mind multiplied by the second. Why was she back in exactly the same place? Why hadn't anything about her circumstances seemed to change? How could she remember so much about a conversation that had lasted less than 30 minutes? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why did she keep glancing nervously into the side mirror, as though she expected another vehicle to appear behind them at any moment? The fear in her eyes was impossible to ignore, and for the first time since meeting her, Michael realized she wasn't simply asking for another ride. She was desperately hoping someone else wouldn't find her first. Michael had no idea that saying yes one more time would place him directly in the middle of a mystery that had been unfolding for years. To understand why Michael Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, we have to return to that first rainy night and look more closely at the details that seemed insignificant at the time. Memory has a strange way of protecting us. It often hides the importance of ordinary moments until much later, when every overlooked word suddenly carries new meaning. As Michael guided his pickup through the rain-soaked highway, the woman remained unusually quiet. She kept both hands wrapped around the straps of her small backpack, as though it contained the only things she had left in the world. The silence inside the truck wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy. Michael had spent years meeting people from every walk of life during his military service, and he had developed a habit of reading people without asking too many questions. The woman didn't appear intoxicated or confused. She wasn't angry. She wasn't panicked. Instead, she seemed exhausted in a way that reached far beyond physical fatigue. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying fear for a very long time. After several miles, Michael finally introduced himself. "I'm Michael," he said with a reassuring smile. The woman looked toward him for only a moment before quietly replying, "I'm Emily." She stopped there. No last name, no explanation. Michael noticed the pause but chose not to press her. Everyone has a story they aren't ready to tell, and he respected that. Instead, they continued driving through the rain while the windshield wipers pushed back against the storm, one slow sweep after another. Several minutes later, Emily surprised him with a question that seemed completely unrelated to their situation. Without taking her eyes off the dark highway ahead, she asked, "Do you believe people deserve second chances?" Michael thought about it before answering honestly. He told her that life rarely gave anyone a perfect path, and that nearly everyone carried regrets they wish they could erase. He believed people could change if they truly wanted to. Emily nodded quietly, almost as though she had expected that answer. Then, after another long silence, she asked something even more unusual. "Have you ever regretted helping someone?" This time, Michael couldn't answer immediately. During his years in the army, he'd seen trust rewarded just as often as it had been betrayed. Even after retirement, he'd encountered people who had taken advantage of his generosity. Yet despite those experiences, he told her the truth. "No," he finally replied. "I've regretted not helping people far more than I've regretted helping them." Emily lowered her head, and for the first time that evening, Michael thought he saw tears beginning to form in her eyes. She quietly whispered, "I hope you still feel that way tomorrow." At the time, Michael assumed she was simply speaking from whatever hardship had brought her to that lonely highway. Looking back, he would realize those words carried far more meaning than either of them understood. As they continued driving, Michael noticed how little Emily actually possessed. The small backpack resting beside her feet appeared almost empty. There were no suitcases, no purse, no shopping bags, no personal belongings that suggested she was traveling anywhere for long. Whatever life she had before that night seemed to fit inside one worn backpack. Michael considered asking whether she had family nearby or someone expecting her, but every instinct told him not to force a conversation she clearly wasn't ready to have. Instead, he focused on getting her somewhere safe before the weather grew even worse. Emily eventually asked if he could drop her near an older roadside motel just outside the neighboring town. It wasn't the kind of place anyone chose unless they had very few options. The faded vacancy sign flickered against the rain, and only a handful of vehicles occupied the parking lot. Michael pulled into the entrance, placed the truck in park, and offered to walk her inside because of the storm. Emily politely declined. She thanked him once again, picked up her backpack, and reached for the door. Just before stepping into the rain, she turned back toward him with an expression he would never forget. There was gratitude in her eyes, but there was also relief, as though something terrible had almost happened and somehow hadn't. Then she quietly said, "Thank you. You probably saved my life tonight." Before Michael could ask what she meant, she closed the truck door, disappeared into the rain, and walked toward the motel without looking back. For the next several months, life returned to normal. Michael never saw Emily again. Occasionally, he wondered whether she had found whatever fresh start she had been searching for, but those thoughts gradually faded beneath the routines of everyday life. He had no reason to believe their paths would ever cross again. As far as he knew, she had simply become another stranger, whose life briefly intersected with his own, before continuing in a different direction. Yet some memories refuse to disappear, even when we convince ourselves they should. Every now and then, Emily's final words echoed in his mind. "You probably saved my life tonight." At first, he interpreted them as nothing more than the gratitude of someone facing difficult circumstances. Months later, those words would haunt him for a completely different reason. Nearly 6 months had passed since Michael Carter last saw Emily, and little about his life had changed. He still woke before sunrise, still spent his days repairing heavy equipment at the local shop, and still drove the same lonely stretch of highway home each evening. The memory of that rainy night had gradually settled into the background of his mind, becoming one of those brief encounters people occasionally think about but never expect to relive. Yet on one cold autumn evening, the weather seemed determined to recreate every detail of that night. Rain hammered against the windshield with the same steady rhythm. The abandoned gas station stood exactly where it always had, its faded signs barely visible beneath the glow of Michael's headlights. As he approached the familiar bend in the road, something immediately caught his attention. A lone figure stood beneath the broken canopy. Michael instinctively eased his foot off the accelerator. Even before the truck drew closer, something about the posture, the backpack, and the way the woman held herself felt strangely familiar. Then she stepped slightly into the light, and Michael felt his stomach tighten. It was Emily, the same woman, the same jacket, the same small backpack resting against her shoulder. It looked as though time itself had frozen since the night they first met. For several seconds, Michael questioned whether exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. But when Emily looked directly at him, there was no uncertainty in her expression. She recognized him immediately. Michael pulled onto the shoulder almost without thinking. Before he could even lower the passenger window, Emily opened the door, climbed inside, and fastened her seatbelt with surprising urgency. Her breathing was uneven, and unlike the first time they met, she wasted no time exchanging polite introductions or hesitant conversation. She looked directly at Michael and quietly said, "I knew you'd stop." The words settled heavily inside the truck. Michael forced a nervous smile, unsure how to respond. There was something unsettling about the certainty in her voice. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It sounded as though she had expected this exact moment for a very long time. Before Michael could ask how she knew he would be there, Emily turned toward the rear window, watching the highway behind them with obvious concern. Michael gently asked if she was all right. She hesitated before answering. "I don't need a ride this time," she whispered. "I need you to keep driving." The seriousness in her voice erased any remaining doubt that something was terribly wrong. Michael glanced toward the empty road in his mirrors, but saw nothing unusual. Even so, he shifted the truck back into gear and slowly pulled away from the abandoned station. For the first several miles, Emily remained almost completely silent. Her eyes rarely left the side mirrors, and every few seconds, she looked over her shoulder, as though expecting someone to appear behind them. Michael finally asked the question that had been building since she entered the truck. "Emily, what's going on?" She swallowed hard before quietly answering. "Someone's been following me." Michael instinctively looked into the rearview mirror again. The highway behind them appeared almost deserted, except for distant headlights that disappeared around the curves. He asked whether she had contacted the police. Emily slowly shook her head. She explained that whoever was following her always stayed just far enough away to avoid attracting attention. They never approached her directly. They never threatened her openly. They simply appeared wherever she went, reminding her that she was never truly alone. Michael wanted to believe she was simply frightened after whatever difficult experiences had brought her to that roadside months earlier. He reminded himself that fear can make ordinary events appear much more dangerous than they really are. Still, something about Emily's expression convinced him she genuinely believed every word she was saying. A few minutes later, headlights appeared in the distance behind them. At first, Michael paid little attention. Highways at night were never completely empty, and another vehicle traveling in the same direction wasn't unusual. But as the miles passed, the same dark-colored SUV remained behind them at exactly the same distance. Michael exited onto a smaller county road that eventually led toward town, expecting the SUV to continue along the highway. Instead, it turned as well. Emily noticed immediately. Without saying a word, she simply pointed toward the mirror. Michael's heartbeat quickened, though he still searched for a reasonable explanation. Perhaps they were simply heading in the same direction. Determined to test the coincidence, he made another unexpected turn onto a quiet residential road before looping back toward the highway. Once again, the SUV matched every movement without hesitation. Michael's grip tightened around the steering wheel. The uneasy feeling he had, dismissed moments earlier, suddenly became impossible to ignore. Emily lowered her voice until it was barely above a whisper. "I told you they were still there." Neither of them spoke again for several seconds. Michael considered reaching for his phone. Should he call the police? Was he witnessing an actual threat? Or was Emily's fear causing both of them to misinterpret an ordinary driver? Every instinct urged caution, yet every glance in the mirror made the coincidence harder to dismiss. The black SUV continued following them through every turn, every intersection, and every change of direction, without falling behind or attempting to pass. Michael's thoughts raced as he weighed every possible decision. If Emily was mistaken, involving law enforcement might only create unnecessary confusion. But if she was telling the truth, every minute they delayed could place both of them in greater danger. He finally asked Emily the one question he had been avoiding since she climbed into the truck. "Who exactly is following you?" Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly reached down, placed her trembling hand on the zipper of her small backpack, and looked directly at Michael with an expression he had never seen before. It wasn't simply fear anymore. It was the expression of someone who had reached the point where keeping a secret had become more dangerous than revealing it. Then she carefully opened the backpack and began removing something wrapped inside a worn manila envelope. Michael glanced toward it for only a brief moment before returning his eyes to the road, but even that quick glance was enough to tell him these weren't ordinary personal belongings. Then she pulled something from her backpack, and Michael instantly realized this was far bigger than either of them. Emily waited until Michael had driven several miles away from the abandoned gas station before she finally reached for the zipper of her small backpack. Up to that point, Michael had assumed the bag contained nothing more than a few clothes and personal belongings. Instead, she carefully removed a weathered manila envelope that looked as though it had been opened and resealed dozens of times. Her hands trembled as she placed it on her lap. She hesitated, staring at the envelope for several seconds before looking toward Michael. "Once you see what's inside," she said quietly, "there's no going back." Michael glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. He wasn't sure what she meant, but the seriousness in her voice immediately told him this wasn't about a broken-down car or someone following them out of simple paranoia. Emily slowly emptied the contents onto the seat between them. There were yellowed newspaper clippings from several states, copies of court documents with names blacked out, handwritten notes, and dozens of photographs held together with worn paper clips. It looked less like someone's personal belongings and more like the evidence file from a years-long investigation. Michael immediately realized that this wasn't something a frightened traveler would normally carry. It was something someone carried because they believed their life depended on it. Michael reached over at a stoplight and picked up one of the newspaper clippings. The headline described the conviction of several members of a criminal organization involved in fraud, intimidation, and violent assaults across multiple states. Another article mentioned missing witnesses whose testimony had suddenly disappeared before trial. Several court documents contained official seals, but almost every identifying name had been carefully covered with black marker. Emily explained that she had spent years collecting every document she could find, believing that one day she might need to prove what had happened if nobody believed her story. Michael continued turning over photographs one by one. Some showed buildings, others showed vehicles parked outside ordinary neighborhoods. Then his hands stopped. His breathing became noticeably heavier. Resting on top of the stack was a photograph of himself sitting behind the wheel of his pickup truck. The image had clearly been taken through a long camera lens from a distance. In the passenger seat sat Emily during their first meeting 6 months earlier. Michael stared at the picture, unable to look away. He knew with absolute certainty that nobody had been standing anywhere nearby that rainy evening. Yet someone had been watching them from the darkness, documenting every moment without either of them realizing it. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the rain outside. Emily finally took a deep breath and admitted the truth she had hidden since the night they first met. She explained that years earlier, she had become trapped inside an abusive criminal network that controlled people through fear, manipulation, financial fraud, and threats against anyone who attempted to leave. Several members had already been arrested after a lengthy investigation, but others remained free, determined to silence anyone capable of identifying them in court. Emily had agreed to cooperate with investigators, and when word spread that she intended to testify, her life changed overnight. She could no longer stay with friends or family because anyone close to her immediately became vulnerable. She moved constantly, avoided using her real identity, and trusted almost no one. The rainy night Michael found her wasn't an accident at all. She had been running after realizing someone had discovered where she was hiding. She never intended to involve a stranger, but when Michael stopped his truck and offered her a ride, people who had been quietly following her suddenly shifted their attention toward him. Without knowing it, Michael had entered their world simply by choosing compassion over caution. Michael struggled to process everything he was hearing. He remembered Emily asking whether people deserved second chances. He remembered her asking if he had ever regretted helping someone. At the time, those questions sounded philosophical. Now they sounded like warnings disguised as conversation. Emily lowered her eyes before quietly confessing the part that filled her with the greatest guilt. "The first time you helped me," she said, "they identified your truck, your face, and your routine. They didn't know who you were before that night. They knew because of me." Michael felt the weight of those words settle heavily over him. Every trip home from work, every familiar stop for coffee, every evening spent alone at his house, suddenly appeared in a different light. Emily explained that she had stayed away for months because she hoped they would eventually lose interest in him. Instead, they continued watching from a distance, convinced that sooner or later she would try to contact the one person who had shown her unexpected kindness. Helping her once had been an accident. Helping her a second time had confirmed exactly what they had been waiting to see. From that moment forward, Michael Carter was no longer an uninvolved stranger. Whether he wanted it or not, he had become part of the story. For several miles, neither of them spoke. The silence inside the truck felt heavier than anything either of them could say aloud. Michael's mind replayed every ordinary moment from the past 6 months, wondering how many times he had unknowingly crossed paths with someone who had been watching him. Every unfamiliar vehicle parked across the street, Every person who seemed to glance in his direction a little too long, every strange feeling he had dismissed as coincidence, suddenly demanded another explanation. Yet even as Emily's confession answered the questions that had haunted him since seeing her again, it uncovered an even greater mystery. If the people following her were determined to keep her quiet, why hadn't they acted already? Why continue watching instead of confronting her directly? Emily slowly looked out the passenger window before whispering words that immediately changed everything once again. The people chasing me aren't the ones I'm most afraid of anymore. Michael turned toward her in disbelief. Until that moment, he had assumed he finally understood who the danger was. He couldn't have been more mistaken. But the biggest surprise wasn't who was chasing her. What happened over the following 24 hours unfolded far more quickly than Michael Carter could have imagined. After hearing Emily's full account and reviewing the documents she had carried for months, Michael made the decision he had been struggling with since the black SUV first appeared behind them. He contacted law enforcement and carefully explained everything that had happened, from the first rainy night 6 months earlier to the photographs hidden inside the manila envelope. At first, the responding officers treated the situation with understandable caution. Stories involving anonymous witnesses, mysterious surveillance, and years of fear often require careful verification. But as investigators examined the documents Emily had preserved and compared them with several ongoing cases in neighboring states, the pieces began fitting together with alarming precision. The newspaper clippings matched open investigations. The court records connected individuals already known to federal authorities. The photographs revealed patterns of surveillance that investigators had quietly suspected but had never fully documented. Even more importantly, Emily possessed information that only someone directly connected to the organization could have known. Within hours, state investigators coordinated with federal agents, and the quiet highway where Michael had unknowingly stepped into someone else's nightmare became part of a much larger investigation that had stretched across state lines for years. Over the next several days, search warrants were executed at multiple properties connected to the network Emily had described. Several suspects were taken into custody without incident, while investigators recovered financial records, communication devices, and additional evidence that strengthened cases already waiting to be prosecuted. News outlets reported a series of coordinated arrests but revealed very few details, leaving the public unaware of how close one frightened witness had come to disappearing before she could testify. Emily's identity remained protected throughout the investigation, and soon afterward, she entered a witness protection program where she could begin rebuilding a life that had been defined by fear for far too long. Before leaving, she met Michael one final time in a secure location arranged by investigators. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes because every additional moment together increased the possibility that someone might connect them again. Emily thanked him with tears in her eyes, admitting that she had carried overwhelming guilt ever since realizing her first encounter with him had unintentionally placed him in danger. Michael quietly reminded her that none of what happened was her fault. The responsibility belonged entirely to those who had chosen intimidation and violence. As they said goodbye, neither of them knew whether they would ever meet again. Emily disappeared into a government vehicle, and within minutes, she was gone, beginning a new chapter under a new identity in a place Michael would never know. Life eventually settled back into its familiar rhythm, though Michael himself was no longer quite the same man. The equipment shop reopened each morning. The same highways stretched beneath his tires every evening. Neighbors waved as they always had, and the routines that once felt ordinary slowly returned. Yet every act of kindness now carried a deeper meaning. Michael understood better than most people that we rarely know the hidden battles another person may be fighting. Sometimes helping a stranger means far more than offering directions or a ride home. Sometimes it becomes the turning point that allows another human being to survive long enough to reclaim their future. Months passed without another unexpected visitor, another suspicious vehicle, or another phone call from investigators. It seemed as though the remarkable chapter had finally reached its conclusion. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, Michael returned home to find a plain envelope resting inside his mailbox. There was no return address, no postage that identified where it had been mailed. Only his name, carefully written across the front, in handwriting he recognized immediately. Inside the envelope rested a single folded sheet of paper. Michael unfolded it slowly and found only one handwritten sentence. "You gave me a second chance, twice." He smiled quietly, recognizing Emily's handwriting from notes he had seen among the documents in her backpack. There was no signature, because none was needed. For the first time in many months, Michael allowed himself to believe she was finally safe. But as he reached deeper into the envelope, his smile slowly disappeared. Another item had been tucked behind the note. It was a photograph. At first glance, Michael assumed it would be an old picture of Emily, beginning her new life somewhere far away. Instead, the image showed someone he had never seen before. A lone stranger stood beside another isolated stretch of highway, under a gray evening sky. The figure appeared stranded beside an older vehicle, with its hazard lights flashing. There was nothing written on the back of the photograph. No location, no date, no explanation. Tucked beneath the photograph was one final slip of paper, containing only a single sentence. "Someone else needs you now." Michael stared at the photograph for several long moments, searching for some clue that would explain why it had been sent to him. There was none. To this day, Michael has never discovered who mailed that envelope or how the photograph came into Emily's possession. Some believe it was simply her way of reminding him that kindness should never disappear because of fear. Others wonder whether someone inside the investigation quietly passed the message along, hoping Michael would continue living by the same principles that had changed one life forever. And then there are those who see something entirely different. They question whether the photograph was intended as gratitude at all. Was it a warning that another person would soon face the same danger? Was it proof that similar stories were unfolding beyond anything Michael had witnessed? Or had one ordinary man, through a single act of compassion on a rainy night, unknowingly become connected to something much larger than he would ever fully understand? Those questions remain unanswered. But perhaps the most important question belongs to all of us. If you were driving down a lonely highway and saw a frightened stranger standing alone in the rain, would you stop a second time? Stories like Michael Carter's have a way of staying with us long after they end, because they force us to confront a question that has no easy answer. Every day, ordinary people pass complete strangers without knowing the battles those strangers are fighting. Most encounters last only a few seconds before both people continue with their lives, never crossing paths again. Yet every so often, one simple decision creates a chain of events that no one could possibly predict. Michael never set out to become part of an investigation. He wasn't searching for recognition, excitement, or danger. He was simply a 58-year-old widower, driving home after another ordinary day, following the values that had guided him throughout his life. He saw someone standing alone in the rain, and he chose compassion over convenience. That single decision didn't just change Emily's future, it quietly reshaped his own. It challenged everything he believed about coincidence, trust, and the unseen connections that sometimes exist between complete strangers. Looking back, Michael often admitted that he could have driven past the abandoned gas station that first night without anyone blaming him. Most people probably would have. But if he had kept driving, Emily's story might have ended very differently. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness changes someone else's life. Sometimes it changes your own forever. Perhaps that's why this story continues to spark conversations wherever it's told. Some people believe Michael was simply in the right place at exactly the right moment. Others believe fate placed those two strangers together because each needed the other more than either of them realized. There are also those who wonder whether the photograph inside that final envelope was truly the end of the story or merely the beginning of another chapter that Michael chose to keep private. We may never know. What we do know is that fear often convinces us to look away when another person needs help the most, while kindness asks us to pause long enough to see another human being. Finding the balance between compassion and caution is never easy, and there is no perfect answer that fits every situation. Michael understood that better than anyone. Even after everything he experienced, he never said he regretted stopping. He simply said he would think a little longer before making the decision again. Maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. True courage isn't the absence of fear. It's refusing to let fear decide the kind of person you become. Now, we'd love to hear what you think. If you had been driving that lonely highway 6 months later and recognized the same stranger standing in the exact same place, would you have stopped the second time? Do you think Emily was telling Michael the truth from the very beginning? Or was she protecting him by revealing only what he needed to know when the time was right? And after everything you've heard, was Michael simply a kind man who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was he incredibly lucky to have survived an experience that could have ended very differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because every perspective tells a different story. If stories like this make you question how well we really know the people we meet, subscribe for more unforgettable mysteries. And don't miss our next story, because sometimes the biggest secrets are hiding in plain sight